In 1819, the military authorities commissioned Major Long to explore the districts between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains, to trace the course of the Missouri and of its principal tributaries, to fix the latitude and longitude of the chief places, to study the ways of the Indian tribes, in fact to describe everything interesting either in the aspect of the country or in its animal, vegetable, and mineral productions. Leaving Pittsburgh on the 5th March 1819, on board the steamship Western Engineer, the expedition arrived in May of the following year at the junction of the Ohio with the Mississippi and ascended the latter river as far as St. Louis. On the 29th June, the mouth of the Missouri was reached. During the month of July, Mr. Say, who was charged with the zoological observations, made his way by land to Fort Osage, where he was joined by the steamer. Major Long turned his stay at Fort Osage to account by sending a party to examine the districts between the Kansas and the Platte, but this party was attacked, robbed, and compelled to turn back after losing all their horses. After obtaining at Cow Island a reinforcement of 15 soldiers, the expedition reached Fort Lisa, near Council Bluff, on the 19th September. There it was decided to winter. The Americans suffered greatly from scurvy, and having no medicines to check the terrible disorder, they lost 100 men, nearly a third of the whole party. Major Long, who had meanwhile reached Washington in a canoe, brought back orders for the discontinuation of the voyage up the Missouri, and for a journey overland to the sources of the Platte, whence the Mississippi was to be reached by way of the Arkansas and Red River. On the 6th June the explorers left Engineers Fort, as they called their winter quarters, and ascended the Platte Valley for more than 100 miles, its grassy plains, frequented by vast herds of bisons and deer, supplying them with plenty of provisions. Those boundless prairies, whose monotony is unbroken by a single hillock, were succeeded by a sandy desert gradually sloping up, for a distance of nearly 400 miles, to the Rocky Mountains. This desert, broken by precipitous ravines, canyons, and gorges, at the bottom of which gurgles some insignificant stream, its banks clothed with stunted and meager vegetation, produces nothing but cacti with sharp and formidable prickles. On the 6th July, the expedition reached the foot of the Rocky Mountains. Dr. James scaled one of the peaks, to which he gave his own name, and which rises to a height of 11,500 feet above the sea level. From the summit of the peak, says the botanist, the view towards the north, west, and southwest is diversified with innumerable mountains all white with snow, and on some of the more distant it appears to extend down to their bases. Immediately under our feet on the west lay the narrow valley of the Arkansas, which we could trace running towards the northwest, probably more than 60 miles. On the north side of the peak was an immense mass of snow and ice. To the east lay the Great Plain, rising as it receded, until in the distant horizon it appeared to mingle with the sky. Here the expedition was divided into two parties, one under the command of Major Long, to make its way to the sources of the Red River, the other under Captain Bell, to go down the Arkansas as far as Port Smith. The two detachments separated on the 24th July. The former, misled by the statements of the Casquier Indians and the inaccuracy of the maps, took the Canadian for the Red River, and did not discover their mistake until they reached its junction with the Arkansas. The Casquiers were the most miserable of savages, but intrepid horsemen, excelling in lassoing the wild mustangs, which are descendants of the horses imported into Mexico by the Spanish conquerors. The second detachment was deserted by 4 soldiers, who carried off the journals of Say and Lieutenant Swift with a number of other valuable effects. Both parties also suffered from want of provisions in the sandy deserts, whose streams yield nothing but brackish and muddy water. The expedition brought to Washington 60 skins of wild animals, several thousands of insects, including 500 new species, 400 or 500 specimens of hitherto unknown plants, numerous views of the scenery, and the materials for a map of the districts traversed. Excelling in lassoing the wild mustangs. The command of another expedition was given in 1828 to Major Long, whose services were thoroughly appreciated. Leaving Philadelphia in April, he embarked on the Ohio and crossed the state of the same name, and those of Indiana and Illinois. Having reached the Mississippi, he ascended that river to the mouth of the St. Peter, formerly visited by Carver, and later by Baron La Hontan. Long followed the St. Peter to its source, passing Crooked Lake and reaching Lake Winnipeg, whence he explored the river of the same name, obtained a sight of the Lake of the Woods and Rainy Lake, and arrived at the plateau which separates the Hudson's Bay Valley from that of the St. Lawrence. Lastly, he went to Lake Superior by way of Cold Water Lake and Dog River. although all these districts had been constantly traversed by Canadian pathfinders, trappers, and hunters for many years previously. It was the first time an official expedition had visited them with a view to the laying down of a map. The explorers were struck with the beauty of the neighborhood watered by the Winnipeg. That river, whose course is frequently broken by picturesque rapids and waterfalls, flows between two perpendicular granite walls crowned with verdure. The beauty of the scenery, succeeding as it did to the monotony of the plains and savannas they had previously traversed, filled the explorers with admiration. The exploration of the Mississippi, which had been neglected since Pike's expedition, was resumed in 1820 by General Cass, governor of Michigan. Leaving Detroit at the end of May with 20 men trained to the work of pathfinders, he reached the upper Mississippi, after visiting Lakes Huron, Superior, and Sandy. His exhausted escort halted to rest whilst he continued the examination of the river in a canoe. For 150 miles, the course of the Mississippi is rapid and uninterrupted, but beyond that distance begins a series of rapids extending over 12 miles to the Pecgama Falls. Above this cataract the stream, now far less rapid, winds through vast savannas to Leech Lake. Having reached Lake Winnipeg, Cass arrived on the 21st July at a new lake, to which he gave his own name, but he did not care to push on further with his small party of men and inadequate supply of provisions and ammunition. The source of the Mississippi had been approached but not reached. The general opinion was that the river took its rise in a small sheet of water known as Deer Lake, 60 miles from Cass Lake. Not however, when General Cass was Secretary of State for War, was this important problem solved. The command of an expedition was then given to a traveler named Schoolcraft, who had in the previous year explored the Chippewa country, northwest of Lake Superior. His party consisted of 6 soldiers, an officer qualified to conduct hydrographic surveys, a surgeon, a geologist, an interpreter, and a missionary. Schoolcraft left St. Marie on the 7th June, 1832, visited the tribes living about Lake Superior, and was soon on the St. Louis River. He was then 150 miles from the Mississippi, and was told that it would take him no less than 10 days to reach the Great River, on account of the rapids and shallows. On the 3rd July, the expedition reached the factory of a trader named Aitken, on the banks of the river, and there celebrated on the following day the anniversary of the independence of the United States. 2 days later Schoolcraft found himself opposite the Pecgama Falls and encamped at Oak Point. Here the river winds a great deal amongst savannas, but guides led the party by paths which greatly shortened the distance. Lake Winnipeg was then crossed, and on the 10th July, Schoolcraft arrived at Lake Cass, the furthest point reached by his predecessors. Map of the sources of the Mississippi, 1836. A party of Chippewa Indians led the explorers to their settlement on an island in the river. The friendliness of the natives led Cass to leave part of his escort with them, and accompanied by Lieutenant Allen, the surgeon Houghton, a missionary, and several Indians, he started in a canoe. Lakes Tassodiac and Crooked were visited in turn. A little beyond the latter, the Mississippi divides into 2 branches or forks. The guide took Schoolcraft up the eastern, and after crossing Lakes Marquette, La Salle, and Cubacana, he came to the mouth of the Newa, the chief tributary of this branch of the Mississippi. Finally, after passing the little lake called Uzawa, the expedition reached Lake Itasca, whence issues the Itascan, or western branch of the Mississippi. Lake Itasca, or Deer Lake as the French call it, is only 7 or 8 miles in extent, and is surrounded by hills clothed with dark pine woods. According to Schoolcraft, it is some 1,500 feet above the sea level, but we must not attach too much importance to this estimate, as the leader of the expedition had no instruments. On their way back to Lake Cass, the party followed the western branch, identifying its chief tributaries. Schoolcraft then studied the ways of the Indians frequenting these districts, and made treaties with them. To sum up, the aim of the government was achieved, and the Mississippi had been explored from its mouth to its source. The expedition had collected a vast number of interesting details on the manners, customs, history, and language of the people, as well as numerous new or little-known species of flora and fauna. The people of the United States were not content with these official expeditions, and numbers of trappers threw themselves into the new districts. Most of them being, however, absolutely illiterate, they could not turn their discoveries to scientific account. But this was not the case with James Patty, who has published an account of his romantic adventures and perilous trips in the district between New Mexico and New California. On his way down the river Gila to its mouth, Paddy visited races then all but unknown, including the Yatans, Ayators, Papuans, Mokes, Umias, Mohawas and Nabajos, with whom but very little intercourse had yet been held. On the banks of the Rio Ayaterrio he discovered ruins of ancient monuments, stone walls, moats and potteries, and in the neighbouring mountains he found copper, lead and silver mines. We owe a curious travelling journal also to Dr. Willard, who, during a stay of 3 years in Mexico, explored the Rio del Norte from its source to its mouth. Lastly, in 1830, one Captain Wyeth and his brother explored Oregon and the neighbouring districts of the Rocky Mountains. After Humboldt's journey in Mexico, one explorer succeeded another in Central America. In 1787, Bernasconi discovered the now famous ruins of Palenque. In 1822, Antonio del Rio gave a detailed description of them, illustrated with drawings by Frederick Waldeck, the future explorer of Palenque, that city of the dead. Between 1805 and 3 journeys were successively taken in the province of Chiapa and to Palenque by Captain William Dupaix and the draftsman Castander, and the result of their researches appeared in 1830 in the form of a magnificent work, with illustrations by Augustine Aglio, executed at the expense of Lord Kingsborough. Lastly, Waldeck spent the years 1832 and at Palenque, searching the ruins, making plans, sections and elevations of the monuments, trying to decipher the hitherto unexplained hieroglyphics with which they are covered, and collecting a vast amount of quite new information alike on the natural history of the country and the manners and customs of the inhabitants. We must also name Don Juan Galindo, a Spanish colonel, who explored Palenque, Yucatán, Copan and other cities buried in the heart of tropical forests. View of the Pyramid of Xochicalco. View of the Pyramid of Xochicalco. Facsimile of early engraving. After the long stay made by Humboldt in equinoctial America, the impulse his explorations would doubtless otherwise have given to geographical science was strangely checked by the struggle of the Spanish colonies with the mother country. As soon, however, as the native governments attained to at least a semblance of stability, intrepid explorers rushed to examine this world, so new in the truest sense, for the jealousy of the Spanish had hitherto kept it closed to the investigations of scientific men. Many naturalists and engineers now travelled or settled in South America. Soon indeed, that is in 1817-1820, the Austrian and Bavarian governments sent out a scientific expedition, to the command of which they appointed Doctors Spix and Martens, who collected a great deal of information on the botany, ethnography, and geography of these hitherto little-known districts, Martens publishing, at the expense of the Austrian and Bavarian governments, a most important work on the flora of the country, which may be looked upon as a model of its kind. At the same time, the editors of special publications, such as Moltbrun's Annals des Voyages and the Bulletin de la Société de Géographie, cordially accepted and published all the communications addressed to them, including many on Brazil and the province of Minas Gerais. About this period too a Prussian major general, the Prince of Wied-Neuwied, who had been at leisure since the Peace of 1815, devoted himself to the study of natural science, geography and history, undertaking, moreover, in company with the naturalists Freycius and Sello, an exploring expedition in the interior of Brazil, having special reference to its flora and fauna. A few years later, i.e. in 1836, the French naturalist Alcide d'Aubigny, who had won celebrity at a very early age, was appointed by the governing body of the museum to the command of an expedition to South America, the special object of which was the study of the natural history of the country. For 8 consecutive years, 500 Aubigny wandered about Brazil, Uruguay, the Argentine Republic, Patagonia, Chile, Bolivia and Peru. Such a journey, says Dumas in his funeral oration on 500 Aubigny, in countries so different in their productions, climate, the character of their soil, and the manners and customs of their inhabitants, was necessarily full of ever-fresh perils. 500 Aubigny, endowed with a strong constitution and untiring energy, overcame obstacles which would have daunted most travellers. On his arrival in the cold regions of Patagonia, amongst savage races constantly at war with each other, he found himself compelled to take part, and to fight in the ranks of a tribe which had received him hospitably. Fortunately for the intrepid student, his side was victorious, and he was left free to proceed on his journey. It took 13 years of the hardest work to put together the results of 500 Aubigny's extensive researches. His book, which embraces nearly every branch of science, leaves far behind it all that had ever before been published on South America. History, archaeology, zoology, and botany all hold honored positions in it, but the most important part of this encyclopedic work is that relating to American man. In it, the author embodies all the documents he himself collected, and analyzes and criticizes those which came to him at second hand, on physiological types, and on the manners, languages, and religions of South America. A work of such value ought to immortalize the name of the French scholar, and reflect the greatest honor on the nation which gave him birth. End of the first part. Part 2. Chapter 1. Voyages round the world and polar expeditions. The Russian fur trade. Krusenstern appointed to the command of an expedition. Naukaheva, Nagasaki, reconnaissance of the coast of Japan. Yezo, the Ainos, Saghalien, return to Europe. Otto von Kotzebue, stay at Easter Island. Penrhyn, the Radek archipelago, return to Russia. Changes at Otaheite and the Sandwich Islands. Beechey's voyage, Easter Island. Pitcairn and the mutineers of the Bounty, the Pomodo Islands, Otaheite and the Sandwich Islands, the Bonin Islands. Lutk, the Quebradas of Valparaiso. Holy Week in Chile, New Archangel, the Kaloches, Aunalaska, the Caroline Archipelago, the canoes of the Caroline Islanders, Guam, a desert island, beauty and happy situation of the Bonin Islands, the Teachauchis, their manners and their conjurers, return to Russia. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Russians for the first time took part in voyages round the world. Until that time, their explorations had been almost entirely confined to Asia, and their only mariners of note were Bering, Tikharakov, Spangberg, Laxman, Krenitsyn, and Sarashev. The last named took an important part in the voyage of the Englishman Billings, a voyage, by the way, which was far from achieving all that might have been fairly expected from the 10 years it occupied, and the vast sums it cost. Adam John von Krusenstern was the first Russian to whom is due the honor of having made a voyage round the world under government auspices, and with a scientific purpose. Born in 1770, Krusenstern entered the English Navy in 1793. After 6 years' training in the Stern School, which then numbered amongst its leaders the most skillful sailors of the world, he returned to his native land with a profound knowledge of his profession, and with his ideas of the part Russia might play in Eastern Asia very considerably widened. During a stay of 2 years at Canton, in 1798, Krusenstern had been witness of the extraordinary results achieved by some English fur traders, who brought their merchandise from the northwest coasts of Russian America. This trade had not come into existence until after Cook's third voyage, and the English had already realized immense sums, at the cost of the Russians, who had hitherto sent their furs to the Chinese markets overland. In 1785, however, a Russian named Chelikov founded a fur trading colony on Kodiak Island, at about an equal distance from Kamchatka and the Aleutian Islands, which rapidly became a flourishing community. The Russian government now recognized the resources of districts it had hitherto considered barren, and reinforcements, provisions, and stores were sent to Kamchatka via Siberia. Krusenstern quickly realized how inadequate to the new state of things was help such as this, the ignorance of the pilots and the errors in the maps leading to the loss of several vessels every year, not to speak of the injury to trade involved in a 2 years' voyage for the transport of furs, first to Okhotsk, and thence to Kayakta. As the best plans are always the simplest, they are sure to be the last to be thought of, and Krusenstern was the first to point out the imperative necessity of going direct by sea from the Aleutian Islands to Canton, the most frequented market. On his return to Russia, Krusenstern tried to win over to his views Count Kushilev, the Minister of Marine, but the answer he received destroyed all hope. Not until the accession of Alexander I, when Admiral Mordunov became head of the Naval Department, did he receive any encouragement. Acting on Count Romanov's advice, the Russian Emperor soon commissioned Krusenstern to carry out the plan he had himself proposed, and on the 7th August, 1802, he was appointed to the command of 2 vessels for the exploration of the northwest coast of America. Although the leader of the expedition was named, the officers and seamen were still to be selected, and the vessels to be manned were not to be had in either the Russian Empire or at Hamburg. In London alone were Lysiansko, afterwards second in command to Krusenstern, and the builder Kasamov, able to obtain 2 vessels at all suitable to the service in which they were to be employed. These 2 vessels received the names of the Nadezhda and the Neva. In the meantime, the Russian government decided to avail itself of this opportunity to send M. de Bisanoff to Japan as ambassador, with a numerous suite and magnificent presents for the sovereign of the country. On the 4th August 1803, the two vessels, completely equipped and carrying 134 persons, left the roadstead of Kronstadt. Flying visits were paid to Copenhagen and Falmouth, with a view to replacing some of the salt provisions bought at Hamburg, and to Cock the Nadiaida, the seams of which had started in a violent storm encountered in the North Sea. After a short stay at the Canary Islands, Krusenstern hunted in vain, as La Pérouse had done before him, for the island of Ascension, as to the existence of which opinion had been divided for some 300 years. He then rounded Cape Frio, the position of which he was unable exactly to determine, although he was most anxious to do so. The accounts of earlier travellers and the maps hitherto laid down varying from degrees 6 to 22 degrees 34. A reconnaissance of the coast of Brazil was succeeded by a sail through the passage between the islands of Gal and Alverdo, unjustly characterized as dangerous by La Pérouse, and on the 21st December 1803, St. Catherine was reached. The necessity for replacing the main and mizzen masts of the Neva detained Krusenstern for 5 weeks on this island, where he was most cordially received by the Portuguese authorities. On the 4th February, the two vessels were able to resume their voyage, prepared to face all the dangers of the South Sea, and to double Cape Horn, that bugbear of all navigators. As far as Staten Island the weather was uniformly fine, but beyond it the explorers had to contend with extremely violent gales, storms of hail and snow, dense fogs, huge waves, and a swell in which the vessels laboured heavily. On the 24th March, the ships lost sight of each other in a dense fog a little above the western entrance to the Straits of Magellan. They did not meet again until both reached Naukahiva. Krusenstern, having given up all idea of touching at Easter Island, now made for the Marquesas or Mendoza archipelago, and determined the position of Fatingu and Udhugu Islands, called Washington by the American captain Ingraham, who discovered them in 1791, a few weeks before Captain Marchand, who named them Revolution Islands. Krusenstern also saw Hiva Hoa, the Dominica of Mendana, and at Naukahiva met an Englishman named Roberts, and a Frenchman named Cabrit, whose knowledge of the language was of great service to him. The incidents of the stay in the Marquesas archipelago are of little interest. They were much the same as those related in Cook's voyages. The total, but at the same time utterly unconscious immodesty of the women, the extensive agricultural knowledge of the natives, and their greed of iron instruments, are commented upon in both narratives. Nothing is noticed in the later which is not to be found in the earlier narrative, if we accept some remarks on the existence of numerous societies of which the king or his relations, priests or celebrated warriors, are the chiefs, and the aim of which is the providing of the people with food in times of scarcity. In our opinion, these societies resemble the clans of Scotland or the Indian tribes of America. Krusenstern, however, does not agree with us, as the following quotation will show. The members of these clubs are distinguished by different tattooed marks upon their bodies. Those of the King's Club, consisting of 26 members, have a square one on their breasts about 6 inches long and 4 wide, and to this company Roberts belonged. The companions of the Frenchman, Joseph Cabrit, were marked with a tattooed eye, and C. Roberts assured me that he never would have entered this association, had he not been driven to it by extreme hunger. There was an apparent want of consistency in this dislike, as the members of these companies are not only relieved from all care as to their subsistence, but, even by his own account, the admittance into them is a distinction that many seek to obtain. I am therefore inclined to believe that it must be attended with the loss of some part of liberty. A reconnaissance of the neighbourhood of Anna Maria led to the discovery of Port Tchichagof, which, though the entrance is difficult, is so shut in by land that its waters are unruffled by the most violent storm. At the time of Krusenstern's visit to Naukahiva, cannibalism was still largely practiced, but the traveller had no tangible proof of the prevalence of the custom. In fact, Krusenstern was very affably received by the king of the cannibals, who appeared to exercise but little authority over his people, a race addicted to the most revolting vices, and our hero owns that, but for the intelligent and disinterested testimony of the 2 Europeans mentioned above, he should have carried away a very favourable opinion of the natives. In their intercourse with us, he says, they always showed the best possible disposition, and in bartering an extraordinary degree of honesty, always delivering their coconuts before they received the piece of iron that was to be paid for them. At all times they appeared ready to assist in cutting wood and filling water, and the help they afforded us in the performance of these laborious tasks was by no means trifling. Theft, the crime so common to all the islanders of this ocean, we very seldom met with among them. They always appeared cheerful and happy, and the greatest good humour was depicted in their countenances. The 2 Europeans whom we found here, and who had both resided with them several years, agreed in their assertions that the natives of Nukuhiva were a cruel, intractable people, and without even the exceptions of the female sex, very much addicted to cannibalism, that the appearance of content and good humour, with which they had so much deceived us, was not their true character, and that nothing but the fear of punishment and the hopes of reward deterred them from giving a loose to their savage passions. These Europeans described, as eyewitnesses, the barbarous scenes that are acted, particularly in times of war, the desperate rage with which they fall upon their victims, immediately tear off their head, and sip their blood out of the skull, one with the most disgusting readiness, completing in this manner their horrible repast. For a long time I would not give credit to these accounts, considering them as exaggerated, but they rest upon the authority of 2 different persons, who had not only been witnesses for several years to these atrocities, but had also borne a share in them, of 2 persons who lived in a state of mortal enmity, and took particular pains by their mutual recriminations to obtain with us credit for themselves, but yet on this point never contradicted each other. The very fact of Robert's doing his enemy the justice to allow that he never devoured his prey, but always exchanged it for hogs, gives the circumstance a great degree of probability, and these reports concur with several appearances we remarked during our stay here, skulls being brought to us every day for sale. Their weapons are invariably adorned with human hair, and human bones are used as ornaments in almost all their household furniture. They also often gave us to understand by pantomimic gestures that human flesh was regarded by them as a delicacy. All the skulls which we purchased of them, says Krusenstern, had a hole perforated through one end of them for this purpose. There are grounds for looking upon this account as exaggerated. The truth, probably, lies between the dogmatic assertions of Cook and Forster and those of the 2 Europeans of Krusenstern's time, one of whom at least was not much to be relied upon, as he was a deserter. And we must remember that we ourselves did not attain to the high state of civilization we now enjoy without climbing up from the bottom of the ladder. In the Stone Age, our manners were probably not superior to those of the natives of Oceania. We must not, therefore, blame these representatives of humanity for not having risen higher. They have never been a nation, scattered as their homes are on the wide ocean, and divided as they are into small tribes, without agricultural or mineral resources, without connections, and with a climate which makes them strangers to want. They could but remain stationary or cultivate none but the most rudimentary arts and industries. Yet in spite of all this, how often have their instruments, their canoes, and their nets excited the admiration of travellers. On the 18th May, 1804, the Nadiader and the Neva left Nukuhiva for the Sandwich Islands, where Krusenstern had decided to stop and lay in a store of fresh provisions, which he had been unable to do at his last anchorage, where 7 pigs were all he could get. This plan fell through, however. The natives of Ohihi or Hawaii brought but a very few provisions to the vessels lying off their southwest coast, and even these they would only exchange for cloth, which Krusenstern could not give them. He therefore set sail for Kamchatka and Japan, leaving the Neva off the island of Karakakwa, where Captain Lisianskoy relied upon being able to revictual. New Zealanders. Facsimile of early engraving. On the 11th July, the Nadiader arrived off Petropalovsky, the capital of Kamchatka, where the crew obtained the rest and fresh provisions they had so well earned. On the 30th August, the Russians put to sea again. Overtaken by thick fogs and violent storms, Krusenstern now hunted in vain for some islands marked on a map found on a Spanish galleon captured by Anson, and the existence of which had been alternately accepted and rejected by different cartographers, though they appear in La Billardiere's map of his voyage. The navigator now passed between the large island of Kyushu and Tengasima, by way of Van Diemen Strait, till then very inaccurately defined, rectified the position of the Liukiu archipelago, which the English had placed north of the strait, and the French too far south, and sailed down, surveyed and named the coast of the province of Satsuma. This part of Satsuma, says Krusenstern, is particularly beautiful, and as we sailed along at a very trifling distance from the land, we had a distinct and perfect view of the various picturesque situations that rapidly succeed each other. The whole country consists of high pointed hills, at one time appearing in the form of pyramids, at others of a globular or conical form, and seeming as it were under the protection of some neighbouring mountain, such as Peak Homer, or another lying north by west of it, and even a third farther inland. Liberal as nature has been in the adornment of these parts, the industry of the Japanese seems not a little to have contributed to their beauty, for nothing indeed can equal the extraordinary degree of cultivation everywhere apparent. That all the valleys upon this coast should be most carefully cultivated would not so much have surprised us, as in the countries of Europe where agriculture is not despised, it is seldom that any piece of land is left neglected. But we here saw not only the mountains even to their summits, but the very tops of the rocks which skirted the edge of the coast, adorned with the most beautiful fields and plantations, forming a striking as well as singular contrast, by the opposition of their dark grey and blue colour to that of the most lively verdure. Another object that excited our astonishment was an alley of high trees, stretching over hill and dale along the coast, as far as the eye could reach, with arbours at certain distances, probably for the weary traveller, for whom these alleys must have been constructed, to rest himself in, an attention which cannot well be exceeded. These alleys are not uncommon in Japan, for we saw a similar one in the vicinity of Nagasaki and another in the island of Mixima. Coast of Japan. Coast of Japan. The Nadiaida had hardly anchored at the entrance to Nagasaki harbour before Krusenstern saw several daimyos climb on board, who had come to forbid him to advance further. Now, although the Russians were aware of the policy of isolation practiced by the Japanese government, they had hoped that their reception would have been less forbidding, as they had on board an ambassador from the powerful neighbouring state of Russia. They had relied on enjoying comparative liberty, of which they would have availed themselves to collect information on a country hitherto so little known, and about which the only people admitted to it had taken a vow of silence. They were, however, disappointed in their expectations. Instead of enjoying the same latitude as the Dutch, they were throughout their stay harassed by a perpetual surveillance, as unceasing as it was annoying. In a word, they were little better than prisoners. Although the ambassador did obtain permission to land with his escort under arms, a favour never before accorded to anyone, the sailors were not allowed to get out of their boat, or when they did land, the restricted place where they were permitted to walk was surrounded by a lofty palisading, and guarded by 2 companies of soldiers. It was forbidden to write to Europe by way of Batavia, it was forbidden to talk to the Dutch captains, the ambassador was forbidden to leave his house. The word forbidden may be said to sum up the anything but cordial reception given to their visitors by the Japanese. Krusenstern turned his long stay here to account by completely overhauling and repairing his vessel. He had nearly finished this operation when the approach was announced of an envoy from the emperor, of dignity so exalted that, in the words of the interpreter, he dared to look at the feet of his imperial majesty. This personage began by refusing the Tsar's presents, under pretence that if they were accepted the emperor would have to send back others with an embassy, which would be contrary to the customs of the country. And he then went on to speak of the law against the entry of any vessels into the ports of Japan, and absolutely forbade the Russians to buy anything, adding, however, at the same time, that the materials already supplied for the refitting and revictualling the vessel would be paid for out of the treasury of the Emperor of Japan. He further inquired whether the repairs of the Nadiaida would soon be finished. Krusenstern understood what was meant as soon as his visitor began to speak, and hurried on the preparations for his own departure. Truly, he had not much reason to congratulate himself on having waited from October to April for such an answer as this. So little were the chief results hoped for by his government achieved, that no Russian vessel could ever again enter a Japanese port. A short-sighted, jealous policy, resulting in the putting back for half a century the progress of Japan. On the 17th April, the Nadiaida weighed anchor, and began a hydrographic survey, which had the best results. La Pérouse had been the only navigator to traverse before Krusenstern the seas between Japan and the continent. The Russian explorer was therefore anxious to connect his work with that of his predecessor, and to fill up the gaps the latter had been compelled for want of time to leave in his charts of these parts. To explore the northwest and southwest coasts of Japan, says Krusenstern, to ascertain the situation of the Straits of Sangha, the width of which in the best charts, Arrowsmith's South Sea Pilot for instance, and the atlas subjoined to La Pérouse's voyage, laid down as more than 100 miles, while the Japanese merely estimated it to be a Dutch mile, to examine the west coast of Yezo, to find out the island of Karafudo, which in some new charts compiled after a Japanese one, is placed between Yezo and Sakhalin, and the existence of which appeared to me very probable, to explore this new strait and take an accurate plan of the island of Sakhalin, from Cape Crillon to the northwest coast, from whence, if a good harbour were to be found there, I could send out my long boat to examine the supposed passage which divides Tartary from Sakhalin, and finally, to attempt a return through a new passage between the Kurils, north of the Canal de la Boussole. All this came into my plan, and I have had the good fortune to execute part of it. Krusenstern was destined almost entirely to carry out this detailed plan. Only the survey of the western coast of Japan, and of the Strait of Sangha, with that of the channel closing the Farakai Strait, could not be accomplished by the Russian navigator, who had, sorely against his will, to leave the completion of this important task to his successors. Krusenstern now entered the Korea Channel and determined the longitude of Tsushima, obtaining a difference of 36 minutes from the position assigned to that island by La Perouse. This difference was subsequently confirmed by Dagelet, who can be fully relied upon. The Russian explorer noticed, as La Perouse had done before him, that the deviation of the magnetic needle is but little noticeable in these latitudes. The position of Sangha Strait between Yezo and Niphon being very uncertain, Krusenstern resolved to determine it. The mouth, situated between Cape Sangha en lat. 41 degrees 16:30 and W long, 219 degrees 46, and Cape Nadiaida en lat. 41 degrees 25:10 W long, 219 degrees 50:30, is only 9 miles wide, whereas La Perouse, who had relied not upon personal observation but upon the map of the Dutchman Vries, speaks of it as 10 miles across. Krusenstern's was therefore an important rectification. Krusenstern did not actually enter this strait. He was anxious to verify the existence of a certain island, Karafonto, Tichoka, or Chicha by name, set down as between Yezo and Sakhalin in a map which appeared at St. Petersburg in 1802, and was based on one brought to Russia by the Japanese Kode. He then surveyed a small portion of the coast of Yezo, naming the chief irregularities, and cast anchor near the southernmost promontory of the island at the entrance to the Straits of La Perouse. Here he learnt from the Japanese that Sakhalin and Karafonto were one and the same island. On the 10th May 1805, Krusenstern landed at Yezo and was surprised to find the season but little advanced. The trees were not yet in leaf, the snow still lay thick here and there, and the explorer had supposed that it was only at Archangel that the temperature would be so severe at this time of year. This phenomenon was to be explained later, when more was known as to the direction taken by the polar current, which, issuing from Bering Strait, washes the shores of Kamchatka, the Kurile Islands and Yezo. During his short stay here and at Sakhalin, Krusenstern was able to make some observations on the Ainos, a race which probably occupied the whole of Yezo before the advent of the Japanese, from whom, at least from those who have been influenced by intercourse with China, they differ entirely. Typical Ainos. Typical Ainos. Facsimile of early engraving. Their figure, says Krusenstern, dress, appearance and their language prove that they are the same people as those of Sakhalin, and the captain of the Castricum, when he missed the Straits of La Perouse, might imagine, as well in Aniwa as in Alkes, that he was but in one island. The Ainos are rather below the middle stature, being at the most 5 feet 2 or 4 inches high, of a dark, nearly black complexion, with a thick bushy beard, black rough hair hanging straight down, and excepting in the beard they have the appearance of the Kamchadales, only that their countenance is much more regular. The women are sufficiently ugly. Their colour, which is equally dark, their coal-black hair combed over their faces, blue-painted lips and tattooed hands, added to no remarkable cleanliness in their clothing, do not give them any great pretensions to loveliness. However, I must do them the justice to say that they are modest in the highest degree, and in this point form the completest contrast with the women of Nukahiva and of Otaheite. The characteristic quality of an Aino is goodness of heart, which is expressed in the strongest manner in his countenance, and so far as we were enabled to observe their actions, they fully answered this expression. The dress of the Ainos consists chiefly of the skins of tame dogs and seals, but I have seen some in a very different attire, which resembled the parkies of the Kamchadales, and is, properly speaking, a white shirt worn over their other clothes. In Aniwa Bay they were all clad in furs, their boots were made of seal skins, and in these likewise the women were invariably clothed. After passing through the Straits of La Perouse, Krusenstern cast anchor in Anua Bay, off the island of Saghalien. Here fish was then so plentiful that 2 Japanese firms alone employ ainos to catch and dry it. It is never taken in nets, but buckets are used at ebb tide. After having surveyed Patience Gulf, which had only been partially examined by the Dutchman Vries, and at the bottom of which flows a stream now named the Neva, Krusenstern broke off his examination of Saghalien to determine the position of the Kurile Islands, never yet accurately laid down, and on the 5th June, 1805 he returned to Petropalovsky, where he put on shore the ambassador and his suite. In July, after crossing Nadiaida Strait between Matona and Ratchona, 2 of the Kurile Islands, Krusenstern surveyed the eastern coast of Saghalien, in the neighbourhood of Cape Patience, which presented a very picturesque appearance, with the hills clothed with grass and stunted trees, and the shores with bushes. The scenery of the interior, however, was somewhat monotonous, with its unbroken line of lofty mountains. The navigator skirted along the whole of this deserted and harbourless coast to Capes Maria and Elizabeth, between which is a deep bay, with a little village of 37 houses nestling at the end, the only one the Russians had seen since they left Providence Bay. It was not inhabited by Ainos, but by Tartars, of which very decided proof was obtained a few days later. Krusenstern next entered the channel separating Saghalien from Tartary, but he was hardly 6 miles from the middle of the passage when his soundings gave 6 fathoms only. It was useless to hope to penetrate further. Orders were given to bout ship, whilst a boat was sent to trace the coastline on either side, and to explore the middle of the strait until the soundings should give 3 fathoms only. A very strong current had to be contended with, rendering this row very difficult, and this current was rightly supposed to be due to the river Amur, the mouth of which was not far distant. The advice given to Krusenstern by the governor of Kamchatka, not to approach the coast of Chinese Tartary, lest the jealous suspicions of the Celestial Government should be aroused, prevented the explorer from further prosecuting the work of surveying, and once more passing the Kurile group, the Nadiaida returned to Petropalovsky. The commander availed himself of his stay in this port to make some necessary repairs in his vessel, and to confirm the statements of Captain Clerke, who had succeeded Cook in the command of his last expedition, and those of Delisle de la Croix, the French astronomer, who had been Behring's companion in 1741. During this last sojourn at Petropalovsky, Krusenstern received an autograph letter from the Emperor of Russia, enclosing the Order of St. Anne as a proof of His Majesty's satisfaction with the work done. On the 4th October 1805, the Nadiaida set sail for Europe, exploring en route the latitudes in which, according to the maps of the day, were situated the islands of Rica de Plata, Guadalupes, Malabrigos, St. Sebastian de Lobos, and San Juan. Krusenstern next identified the Farallon Islands of Anson's map, now known as St. Alexander, St. Augustine, and Volcanoes, and situated south of the Barninsima group. Then crossing the Formosa Channel, he arrived at Macau on the 21st November. He was a good deal surprised not to find the Neva there, as he had given instructions for it to bring a cargo of furs, the price of which he proposed expending on Chinese merchandise. He decided to wait for the arrival of the Neva. Macau seemed to him to be falling rapidly into decay. Many fine buildings, he says, are ranged in large squares, surrounded by courtyards and gardens, but most of them uninhabited, the number of Portuguese residents there having greatly decreased. The chief private houses belong to the members of the Dutch and English factories. 12 or 15,000 is said to be the number of the inhabitants of Macau, most of whom, however, are Chinese, who have so completely taken possession of the town that it is rare to meet any European in the streets, with the exception of priests and nuns. One of the inhabitants said to me, "We have more priests here than soldiers," a piece of raillery that was literally true, the number of soldiers amounting only to 150, not one of whom is a European, the whole being mulattoes of Macau and Goa. Even the officers are not all Europeans. With so small a garrison it is difficult to defend 4 large fortresses, and the natural insolence of the Chinese finds a sufficient motive in the weakness of the military to heap insult upon insult. Just as the Nadiaida was about to weigh anchor, the Neva at last appeared. It was now the 3rd November, and Krusenstern went up the coast in the newly arrived vessel as far as Whampoa, where he sold to advantage his cargo of furs, after many prolonged discussions which his firm but conciliating attitude, together with the intervention of English merchants, brought to a successful issue. On the 9th February, the two vessels once more together weighed anchor and resumed their voyage by way of the Sunda Isles. Beyond Christmas Island they were again separated in cloudy weather and did not meet until the end of the trip. On the 4th May, the Nadiaida cast anchor in St. Helena Bay, 60 days' voyage from the Sunda Isles and 79 from Macau. "I know of no better place," says Krusenstern, "to get supplies after a long voyage than St. Helena. The road is perfectly safe, and at all times more convenient than Table Bay or Simon's Bay at the Cape. The entrance, with the precaution of first getting near the land, is perfectly easy, and on quitting the island nothing more is necessary than to weigh anchor and stand out to sea. Every kind of provision may be obtained here, particularly the best kinds of garden stuffs, and in 2 or 3 days a ship may be provided with everything.